At the 2014 United Nations Climate Summit, then President Barack Obama stated that there's one issue that will define the contours of the century more dramatically than any other, and that's the urgent threat of a changing climate. It then became clear to many that day that climate change was a real issue. The fact that the president of the arguably largest, most powerful nation in the world wasn't stating that he would be joining the climate change initiative spoke volumes to many people. A year later, then it came to no surprise that legislation was made to combat climate change, not only at the national, but also on the international level. President Obama announced that the United States had entered the Paris Agreement, which was an agreement between all members of the United Nations to help combat climate change. However, the decision has faced a large amount of scrutiny, with many debating whether the United States should continue remaining in the Paris Agreement, with significant arguments over whether the agreement is helping or hindering the United States in their ability to combat climate change. According to the BBC, the United States has pledged $3 billion USD to climate change funds. This amount is in fact larger than any other country has, especially amongst the world powers such as China and Russia. In addition to this, according to UNFCCC 2020 annual report, developed countries are expected to mobilize 100 billion USD to help combat climate change. With large amounts of funds being demanded by the Paris Agreement, it seemed like there's no benefit to the United States being part of it. In fact, it seems like they'd be better off leaving and making their own climate change initiative with the resources that they have. It appears as if the United States is faced with an issue of needing to act to stop climate change. The Paris Agreement is not favorable to the United States, and it would be better if the country withdrew. The Paris Agreement is insufficient and unfair towards the United States. In Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, it states that one of the main purposes of the agreement is to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It appears as if there's an emphasis in entering global cooperation, since the agreement would only work if multiple nations conducted their business with this thought in mind. The general consensus amongst people is that climate change must be taken seriously by all people of all nations around the world. But with those in developed countries having more funds and those in developing countries struggling, there's a greater emphasis on developed nations such as the United States to help fund the other countries. In Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, it states that developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries parties with respect to both mitigation, adaptation, and continuation of their existing obligations under the Convention. This appears to be understandable, but as I will note later, it may become problematic. Another issue, according to Melanie Banks, in ethics and the environment, is that the problem did not happen overnight, and it will not be solved overnight, as it will take years for the current emission levels to drop, even if all greenhouse gas emissions stopped immediately. With this thought in mind, questions the ability of the Paris Agreement to do enough, sanctioning countries that do not do enough in their nation to pass legislation to limit emissions. With the agreement being able to enforce certain procedures, it places unnecessary pressure on the United States to essentially pick up for other nations that do not do enough within their own borders. The issues with the Paris Agreement largely stem from the lack of accessibility toward other nations. The United Nations is seen as a global leader in the social issues, which gives a country a significant say in matters that are important to the future of the world. However, with the profound position that the country occupies within the social realm, it is also subject to large responsibility, and that is one of the reasons why the agreement may have been unfavorable towards the United States. There's many notable countries that emit a significant portion of greenhouse gases annually, which include not only the United States. Other countries that do this include Australia, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, Mongolia, just to name a few. Additionally, many greenhouse gas emissions have occurred over centuries, which means that countries that may not be emitting many emissions now may have contributed a significant amount before, and it seems unfair that they reap benefits from being more cleaner today than it did before, although most of the emissions that are present in the atmosphere today came from them. One unforeseen issue that has caused some issues within the framework of combating the climate change is COVID-19 pandemic. According to Carolina Arlota of ILSA Journal of International Competitive Law, the pandemic is likely to increase emissions of GHGs unless countries actively engage in investing in a greener economy. The important part of this statement is that countries must be actively engaging in improving their infrastructure. However, in the perspective of the United States, these countries aren't doing enough, and eventually the fault of their financial misconduct eventually comes into their country. With these issues in mind, some of you may be wondering, how can the United States solve the issues that are embedded within the agreement? Well, the first solution would be to leave the agreement altogether. Now, that may come as a shock to many of you, but I assure you this isn't a dig against climate change. In fact, this is quite the opposite. In order to help combat climate change, the United States would be better off leaving the Paris Agreement and potentially creating their own agreement. You see, the agreement has created some sense of dependency amongst developing nations that inhibits their ability of being able to progress. However, in fact, according to Noah Sachs of Ecology Law Quarterly, the problem with relying on voluntary pledges, however, is that if the aggregate emissions reductions expected under the NDCs are insufficient to keep warming with tolerable levels, there's no stick to force states to commit to greater reductions. What he's essentially saying is that it's hard to ensure countries will follow the procedures that they say they will. Under the Paris Agreement is a pledge, and it is completely voluntary, and there is no legal restrictions against this. That could hinder the ability for countries to progress. If the United States were able to create their own climate agreement, they might be able to create legally binding contracts with greater financial incentives, which may increase the ability for developing countries especially to partake in these climate agreements. Considering the United States is the largest contributor within the agreement, if they were to leave and different climate change legislation with greater financial incentives, many countries may be willing to join, although it requires more obligations. It seems fair to state that the Paris Agreement, although having good intentions, isn't enough to solve climate change, and it would most likely take a different approach, one that involves more incentives, to have all the countries around the world contribute to putting an end to these harmful acts against our planet. The question of whether the United States should leave the Paris Agreement comes down to multiple reasons. The problem revolves around the finance of the deal unjustly targeting the United States. The solution to the problem will most likely reside in the ability of the United States to leave the Paris Agreement and create their own climate change initiative that is fair and includes incentives for each individual country for reaching their own goals. It's important that we act now to combat climate change before it becomes too late. The decisions we make today will impact our future, or you could even go as far to say it would impact if we will even have a future at all. Ultimately, we must make the most informative decision possible, since it's one issue that will define the contours of the century more dramatically than any other.